I would like to invite Mr. Shankar Venkateswaran, our keynote speaker for today.
Whenever I'm asked to speak, and I usually say no, because I have had one of the most forgetful forgettable actually experience I've had was once I was asked, Tata Steel, I used to work with the Tatas, and Tata Steel conducts something called Samvad every year, where they invite indigenous communities from all across the world to spend 3 or 4 days in Jamshedpur. And they asked me to speak in one of those sessions on climate change. I should have known that that is a stupid thing to do, because how can I speak to a bunch of indigenous people who sort of live, breathe, do everything about climate change, forests, everything else? I mean, they know about it more than anyone else. What am I going to tell them? So I should have just said no, right? But I made that mistake of talking to them, and I put my foot into my mouth, and it was a terrible experience. Something I said very forgettable. However, the good thing was that embarrassing experience led to my sitting down with a bunch of them and just chatting about different things, and I learned so much. And I think the reflections that I have from that is not what I foolishly said on stage, because I think everybody thought that was foolish and they forgot, which is good, but what I learned from those conversations with them. And I think it's important to sort of think about that. And that's really, in a sense, what I'm going to speak about in the next 15 or 20 minutes. I'm calling this talk Stewards and Victims: Supporting India's Poor in Combating Climate Change. And I'm thankful to Satya for suggesting steward. It's a term that actually describes the role of what many communities do, especially forest communities, because that's really what they do. They play a stewardship role in the natural resources. But I think my reflections after that very disastrous talk was actually led me on a path of trying to think about some of these things far more than I've ever had. So for example, we in India, globally, in all climate change negotiations, we talk about how our per capita income is, our per capita carbon emissions is so low. It's under 2 tons per annum per capita. But how has it reached there? Because I don't emit 2 tons. I emit far more than 2 tons. I'm sure all of us in the room emit 6, 7, 8 tons. We managed to get that average just because the poor don't emit anything. So they are actually subsidizing us and give us the arguments in international forums to say, don't push that climate change agenda on us. So we need to be actually grateful to them, and we are not. Look at the natural resources that all the disadvantaged communities protect for us: the forests, the water bodies, the rivers. All that is something that they do. Look at how little they consume. There is, SDG 12 is about responsible production and consumption. The bottom line is consumption. And look at how we, or certainly, okay, let me speak for myself, how much I consume and how little they do. And they live SDG 12. I don't think I can say that for myself. And then, of course, look at how they look after life on land, life underwater, SDGs 15 and 16. So I think the fact of the matter is, and we all know this intuitively, we know this, but it's sort of, you need to absorb this to sort of realize how privileged we are, how much more privileged we are than we realize, and how little are we acknowledging the contribution of the poor, of the disadvantaged, of the excluded in this whole battle against climate change. And it's a battle because it's something that we caused, but it's a battle for them because they did not cause it. And that's the irony of this whole climate change issue, because the ones who suffer the most are the ones who cause the least amount of damage. And I think that's something that bothers me and has been bothering me. And That was one of the good things out of that disastrous talk. So let me expand on this a bit more and just share some thoughts on this. One of the things that happens, and I love Naren's story. I mean, Naren's always had a knack of telling stories. I'm lousy at it. But I think, as he talked about that wise person who said that to him, there's another wise person who in some meeting said something very, very wise, which is that, why do we keep harping about the fact that we need to save the planet? We're not saving the planet. The planet is very well off without us. We are trying to save ourselves. Let's be very clear about that. The planet is fighting back, and the planet will be delighted once it exterminates human beings from here, and the planet will flourish. That's really what's going to happen. So we are saving ourselves. Let's not try and put that on someone else. It's a very selfish agenda. And it is an important agenda because we've caused this problem. So let's talk about what happens when climate change discussions go on. What do people sitting on the table talk about? People sitting on the table are the privileged. And all they talk about is one aspect of climate change, which is how do we reduce emissions, the mitigation agenda. It's absolutely what the discussions are all about. And that's fine. It should be, because we definitely need to emit less, no question. But if you start going to the other aspects of the climate change narrative, or the climate change, if you unpack climate change and figure out what we need to do, the second part is what we call adaptation. Okay, how do we deal with the impacts of climate change? And I think there the dialogues are very limited in all these fora. It's limited to what we do about drinking water, what do we do maybe a little bit more about water, what do we do about sea level rise? And these are all concerns, again, of the privileged. We are not talking anything beyond that in these discussions. The third aspect of climate change, which is what we call loss and damage, which is what happens when there is a climate event and people, especially and not surprisingly the poor, get negatively impacted. What happens to them? How do we compensate? How do we do anything about that? Almost no dialogue. Globally, I think in the last COP, there was some discussion that was started on loss and damage, but it's a agenda that keeps getting pushed. Why? Because the loss and damage is the result of people who have done the historical emissions. Getting and acknowledging loss and damage is about saying we've done that, and then you worry about reparations. Because if you've caused some damage, there are reparations. Those are the consequences, and that's not what they want to get into. So if you look at it, there is a whole bias in all climate change discussions on mitigation. Everybody just harping on how do we reduce emissions. Nobody's talking about adaptation, and very few people are talking about loss and damage. And I think that's the tragedy of it, because the latter two, the ones who are most impacted, are the poor, and they don't count in this discussion. And that's, I think, part of what bothers me in some of these discussions. But let's take each one of them, because all of these are important. And all of these, not only the poor have a role to play, have played a role, and will continue to play a role in mitigation, in adaptation, and in loss and damage. And we need to understand that and figure out how we can support that process. So let's take mitigation. So as I said, there's a mitigation bias, but I'm not trying to say that mitigation is not important. Of course it is. Everybody knows that. But what does the science tell us? So science tells us that if we have to keep warming under well below 2 degrees, the Paris Agreement, we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. That's what the science tells us, and there's enough consensus on that. So let's not dispute that science. Net zero by 2050. But what does net zero mean? Net zero is a simple acknowledgement that we need to emit less, but by 2050, we cannot emit zero. We will continue to emit. So what we need to do is to take the balance and pull it out of the atmosphere and keep it somewhere. So removal, sequestration. So that's the net zero equation. Emit less and take away the rest and sequester it. Now, when you talk about reduction, so let's take these two parts of this equation. Let's talk about reduction and let's see what the poor have to do with that reduction side of things. So obviously, a lot of the poor, especially in India, are involved in agriculture and food, in the food production system. And we know that food production systems are a significant contributor to global warming. That's a fact. We can't deny that fact. Estimates are anywhere from 25 to 30% of warming is due to what happens in agriculture. Methane, NOx are the big contributors. So we know that. And we also know that amongst the various contributors to that is rice cultivation and, of course, the cattle, right? These are the two big contributors to NOx and methane. So we need to deal with this issue. So we need to change our energy system. That's another discussion. We're not getting into that. So renewables and all that other stuff is obviously something we need to do. But we also need to deal with this. Now, lots of technologies exist. Okay, so there is, for example, rice cultivation. SRI, we know, reduces that production of methane and NOx by a significant amount. We know that anaerobic digesters exist and technologies of that kind. And I'm not a technology expert. I'm just talking about things that I know a little bit about. They all exist. So it's not that we can't solve for the problem, but we still need to find a way to use that technology. Technology needs to get there. Those technologies and methods and approaches needs to get to people, and they need to be adapted. They need to be supported, and this requires a lot of work. But apart from that, technology and methods need to be continuously innovated. We need to find newer ways of doing this. The trouble with a lot of technology, especially in agriculture, and I'm speaking to a bunch of people who already know that, is that it's not sort of addressed to the key facts of how agriculture is done in India. Small and medium farmers. All technologies are large scale kind of thing. So how do we get those technologies? So obviously research needs to happen, funding needs to be there for that, and so on and so forth. So basically, we have technologies that need to move to the poor, and they need to be supported. New technologies need to be developed constantly and continuously. All of that requires a whole bunch of inputs, right? It requires policy inputs. It requires finance. It requires researchers working together, and so on and so forth. So there's straight away something that tells us that there are too many moving parts in this, and we need to find a way to get all this together. And collaboration, obviously, has to be the way forward. But it needs all of that. It needs policy. It needs researchers. It needs technology. It needs people who can take that stuff from the lab to the land. It needs all of that. And many of us sitting in the room, I have a role to play in any of these bits. Question is, how do we make this happen? Are we doing enough? I think that becomes the question when it comes to mitigation in the kind of spaces that we are interested in. Now, let's talk about removal and sequestration. And the buzzword now is nature-based solutions. That's what nature has been doing, right? And that's what forest-based communities have been doing all their lives. That's what they do. Protect forests, afforestation, reforestation. That's the easiest low-hanging fruit to do. Now, conservation of forests. I mean, we shouldn't be over-romantic about the role that the indigenous communities play, but it is intuitive for them to protect forests. It's because they understand the balances that Naren was talking about, and it's something that is intuitive to them. But just if you look at the pressures around them, and you look at the fact that they are neither acknowledged for that key role that they play as stewards, and are certainly not compensated in any way for doing that, there is a losing and a downward spiral in terms of motivation to keep that going. And that's becoming a problem. And that's one of the reasons why this whole conflict that starts happening between the Adivasis and the forest department and everyone else. And so somewhere the conservation agenda, and there's also, of course, problems or differences of opinion between community-based organizations who look at communities and forest-based communities as stewards, and environmentalists who see them as part of the problem and not part of the solution. So there are lots of complicated sort of parts over there, and we need to understand that. But fundamentally, the conservation agenda has to sort of, you can't just ring fence a place and say we're going to conserve it. It has to be an active conservation at all kinds, and therefore communities have to play a role. The reforestation agenda is another complex thing, and that's, I think, where one of the areas that Cognisphere works on, and at least there are models out there. The models of working in private lands, providing afforestation support, using species that also benefit the communities. You're killing so many birds with one stone. The benefits of those kinds of species, the stake in preserving those reforested resources, and so on and so forth. So there are lessons that are already out there. And it's about then the challenge for us is in this agenda of reforestation, how do we continue to build stake, and how do we ensure that stake is such that protection happens and preservation happens. And if you don't do that, it is not going to happen, because that's the nature of the beast. So the whole sequestration agenda, from basically based on the photosynthesis way of doing it, it requires a whole set of things that need to be in place, and all of those are in disarray. And it's about, therefore, looking at how do we scale community engagement? How do we create that stake? How does it make sense for them? And how do we reward them for doing what they're doing about conserving forests or conserving plantations or conserving any other form of reforestation and afforestation? I think that's the big thing. How do we build that stake? How do we take the lessons that are happening, like what Cognisphere is doing and others are doing, to scale, to out of private lands to public lands, because that's the large part of it, and that's what we need to do. And I think those are the kind of challenges. So what are the policy questions there? What are the kinds of models that need to happen there? I think those are all questions that we need to work on. And we've done joint forest management, we've done all kinds of things in the past. And one school of thought is we've done it, it hasn't worked, forget it. But I don't think that can be the answer anymore, because the problem is far more complex. And I believe certainly places where I have been engaged with some FRA-related work with communities, the results have been very, very positive. So clearly there is a community-centric way of trying to make this happen. It will work. It does work. It's about scale. It's about changing mindsets of the forest bureaucracy, about changing the mindsets of traditional conservationists and so on and so forth. But this agenda, therefore, in the mitigation space of removing and sequestering carbon, becomes a very, very big agenda. Now let's move to adaptation. Adaptation, and how do we ensure in the adaptation game that it's not survival of the fittest, but it's survival of the weakest? Because the difference between us and animals is exactly that. The animal kingdom is survival of the fittest. The human is survival of the weakest. Otherwise, we won't be looking after our children the way we do, right? Because they are the weakest, and we look after them. So why do we, when we grow up, not think about the survival of the weakest? And that's where the adaptation agenda starts going haywire. So what is the adaptation agenda all about? We know that even if we turn off the tap on GHG emissions today and say, okay, we magically find a way to do that, we will have to deal with the impacts of what we've done in the past for decades. That's a fact. So we will have heat, we will have droughts, we will have floods, we will have sea level rise, we will have storm surges, we will have water shortages, even if you turn off the tap today. That's clear. We all know that. Okay. So what we know that we're going to live with this anyway. Now, as I said earlier, the dialogues with the privileged are very limited in this space because they're not that impacted. But actually what happens is we know, I mean, everybody knows that the one thing about climate is it doesn't distinguish between the poor and the rich. Everyone gets impacted. The difference between the poor and the rich, the privileged and the non-privileged, is your ability to cope with it. That's really where the difference lies. So if you can't afford electricity, if you can't afford a fan, if you can't afford to buy drinking water, so all of this will be a problem. But those who can't afford any of this, which is the poor, are going to face are not going to be able to cope with the impacts of climate change. It's very straightforward. What about in the livelihood space? As we said, most of the people that many of us in this room work with, or most of India's poor, live and work in rural India and rural livelihoods. All of them depend on water, rainfall. We know that 70% of India's agriculture is still rain-fed. So all that gets impacted with climate change. We know that. But so what happens to those whose livelihoods are so vulnerable to having predictable rainfall, to having to deal with pests that they are familiar with, and not the new pests and the pest incidences that are going to happen when warming happens? Because there are enough studies that show with warming, the pest incidences are going to increase, and they're going to be of different kinds. So you're going to have a completely new way of trying to understand those attacks and so on. So if your livelihoods are dependent on, for example, agriculture or farm and off-farm areas, and if you're not able to buy your way through heat and thirst, you are going to be severely impacted. You're going to be a victim of climate change. It's as simple as that. And that's really where all our poor are, because they are more vulnerable. We know that. So what is required in the adaptation agenda for as far as the poor are concerned? And there are obviously, again, two dimensions to it. One is what needs to happen, and what support we need to ensure for the poor during distress. And there are going to be more and more distress conditions. We know that. We talked about heat, drought, floods, cyclones, all of that. There's going to be more of that. So obviously, in times of distress, you need a whole bunch of inputs and support. You need emergency shelters. You need ways to deal with sea level rise, whether they be NBS-based like mangroves or non-NBS-based like seawalls. There'll be food issues during droughts and famines and so on and so forth. So there's a whole agenda of actually providing support and succor during the times of distress, which climate change will inevitably bring about. So that's one whole agenda. And, we've become better at dealing with that over the years, but clearly we don't know what's the extent to which this is going to increase with the climate change impacts going forward. The second bit, of course, is in protecting livelihoods, which are going to be severely impacted by climate change. And again, that comes back to some of the issues that all of us in the room are familiar with, and many of us play a role. So how do we ensure climate smart agriculture? What does that even mean? I mean, it's a nice term, but what does that even mean? How do we, it's about obviously, researching and getting more drought resistant seeds. It's about more crop per drop, water conservation, using less water to produce the outputs that we want. Pest management, as I talked about, is going to be a big issue. As warming happens, the kinds of pest attacks are going to be very different from what we've done before. So trying to deal with that. So again, like in the case of mitigation, there are solutions that exist, but are the solutions reaching there? Are they getting to the people who need it? Are there people who are facilitating that? That becomes the question. And the answer is yes, in places, no, largely. But we also then need more technologies, more methods, more processes. So there's a whole agenda out there of trying to say, we've not solved it. We need to find a new solution. So existing solutions, how do we get it there? What are the new solutions? how do we make those investments? So there's an investment question, there's a policy question, there's again a partnerships question. And although we can say that a lot of this is the role of the state, and we are part of that process of facilitating and enabling, but the state needs to be pushed, needs to be nudged, needs to be shoved to make all these kinds of changes. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And I think that's the role that all of us need to think about. Finally, let me just talk about loss and damage. And I'm not going to spend too much of time on that because that's, again, something that we in India and many of us who work with communities understand this, because that's one of the things we do all the time. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I chair Oxfam, and this is one of the things Oxfam does, humanitarian relief, and we've been doing more and more of it every year. And some of them are repetitive, right? Floods in Kerala a couple of times. Assam, Bihar, so it's an annual affair. So we know how to, in some senses, deal with that. But it's interesting how, again, the global discourses are going. As I said earlier, there is great reluctance to discuss loss and damage at a global level. Great reluctance. For the reasons I've already said. But that's a bit we can influence very little, because that's geopolitics. And, it's a very complex sort of set of equations that result in something meaningful to happen in loss and damage. So we still need to play a role as civil society, as organizations that are concerned, but let's accept the fact that a role can be only limited. But a role, that whole loss and damage question, and the inequality that causes that impacts that results in an unequal impact of loss and therefore of damage within the country is, again, something that we need to, as people sitting in the room, engage with. So even if, let's say, we have a global agreement that there has to be some compensation for loss and damage, which will come from the global community. But once it comes into a nation, how it then goes to people who need it the most, who are the most impacted, who are the victims, becomes another question, right? And I think that's something that we need to engage in. I don't know how much of a discussion happens in the NDMA, for example, on the kind of disasters that are going to happen because of climate change, and what can we do about it? How do we ensure equity? How do we ensure fairness? How do we ensure swift response? Those are discussions and dialogues, is something that I don't know how much of that happens. And we need to be part of that. We need to push that. Because if we, in some ways, people who understand what happens to the poorest, if we don't bring in their concerns into these discussions, they're not going to be talked about. So I think this loss and damage bit is something that we need to understand, that it's not something that happens necessarily at a macro level. I mean, there are macro policies, but the devil is when it happens and in the micro. And I've been part of multiple disaster responses in my work. And I think the whole equity question is such a huge one. And when you have more and more disasters coming thanks to climate change, that equity question will never go away unless we find a way of systematically engaging and discussing that. So I think these are some of the things to think about when we're talking about the climate change impacts, and especially on the poor, and how do we need to support that. So I'll just sort of summarize and say, what are the 4 or 5 things that we need to think about? And perhaps today's discussions and future discussions can talk about it, but this is my 5 based on what I just said. So one is the whole issue around policy changes. Public policy, not just laws, processes, rules, mechanisms, schemes, there are a whole bunch of details over there. What are the changes that we think we need to ensure that the paradigm that we have, which is the polluter pays paradigm, moves to the preserver or the protector profits paradigm? Right now, it's about just, okay, even the polluter pays paradigm is not played out. It's a nice word, but you're not actually asking the polluter to pay a fair amount. But even if you do that, what do you do with what they pay for? Where is the equity in that? That's certainly not something that is talked about. And so we need to find mechanisms and policies to ensure that that happens. So the preserver and the protector needs to profit from all the work that they do. They need to be rewarded. They need to be acknowledged. They need to get something out of this. Otherwise, they're going to turn rogue. And I'm going to be sitting with them and saying, yes, you need to turn rogue because nobody is listening to you. Nobody is acknowledging what you do. The second type of policy and process change is when it comes to all of these things that we talked about, the mitigation agenda, technologies to how does this ecosystem where our poor live and contribute, how can they be supported in emitting less? How can they be supported in ensuring that that the adaptation pieces that they need to build into their system gets built into their system? So again, policy processes over there. The third is the whole question around investments, and a lot of these are public investments. We all know, and we've talked about the fact that public investments in rural India, especially in agriculture, have just been stagnant, if not coming down, and certainly not being not looked at as fit for purpose. The kind of investments we need to make is very different in a climate change affected agenda, and some of those we talked about. So what are the kinds of investments that need to be made? For what purposes? What problems do we need to solve? And whose problems do we need to solve from those investments? Those are key questions that we need to address. Now, all of this requires all kinds of collaborations, SDG 70. And I think that's really the important thing. Let's face the fact that the way we've been, as civil society, been working in the past is not going to continue to work in the future. We are under a lot of stress. We are under a lot of threat. We are under all kinds of positions where it's hard for us to do it the old-fashioned way. So we need to find new ways of trying to deal with this. We need to find new collaborators to deal with. We can't just be amongst civil society. We need to work with a whole bunch of people, with academia. We need to work with researchers. We need to work with business. Because some of these things are so complex, and given where civil society is seen in the whole advocacy policy space, we need allies who can get into the doors. And so we need to think very differently about the way we've been doing public policy influencing, because the traditional way of doing it is not going to work. Certainly dharnas and everything else are completely out of the window. So we need to find new ways of doing this. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for civil society. Civil society has, plenty of challenges. This is one more of them. Of how do we get policy to change? How do we provide the kind of inputs and the nudges that require to happen? And if we think that we're going to do it all by ourselves as an individual entity or as a sector, as civil society, I don't think we're going to get there. So we need collaborations. We need different kind of collaborations. And I think some of the people in the room who come from different bits of society, I think that's an interesting mix to sort of think about how do we work together to get some of these changes, these policies, these investments, all of that to happen. And I hope, and I know that in some of the panel discussions we have, these are some of the questions that we're going to try and answer. So I hope I've given you some food for thought in some of these panels so that you can take this forward and then meet what we all are interested in doing, which is rewarding the stewards and protecting the poor from things that they are just not responsible for, but they seem to be facing it all alone. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.